Every day I read articles and social media posts screaming about how our data privacy is violated. The data of every citizen is constantly and systematically collected and analyzed and used for all sorts of purposes, and it must stop. We must protect our data privacy. At least that's what a lot of people say. Today, I'm going to be blasphemous. I'm going to suggest that these claims about privacy violations are misguided. I'm going to give three arguments for thinking that we should care far less about quote unquote our data being collected than we should about what it's used for. But 2 points before proceeding. First, and this has to be said because people will accuse me of thinking otherwise, I think privacy is very important. So don't go around saying I'm a fascist or I'm supporting limitless wiretaps or any such nonsense. Privacy is important. It's also complicated. First, there are different ways of thinking about privacy, and second, there are other values we should constantly balance against the value of privacy. And pointing these things out doesn't make me a covert member or a useful idiot of the CIA. The second thing is that, look, there's a lot more to say about privacy than I'm going to say here. The things I'm going to say here are a start, and I'm going to focus on three misguided ways that people think about privacy. There may very well be well-guided ways that people think about privacy that lead to very different conclusions from mine, and I'll discuss those another day. For now, I'm going to give you these three arguments as food for thought, and I acknowledge it's not the whole meal. All right, with all those caveats to the side, please don't kill me. Now, let's go think about three arguments for thinking that the way in which people think about data privacy is misguided. All right, here's confusion number one. This is something that people like to say about quote unquote their data. So imagine these are the words that I hear by somebody else. I go on social media where I post photos, I write stuff, I view content, and again, I share content, I click on ads, and I buy things, and they're tracking all of that. But that's my data. I never said they could do that with my data. They never got my consent, and so they're violating my privacy. All right, that's the line of thought that is very common that I want to think about. I actually think that this line of thought is totally confused. And the core of the confusion, or maybe I should better say the faulty line of reasoning, consists in a slide from, quote, this data is about me to, quote, this is my data. So it goes from this data is about me and concluding, therefore, it's my data. But the former simply doesn't entail the latter. So here's an example to demonstrate exactly that there can be data that's about you that's not yours. So suppose you're sitting in a cafe when you see me walk in and you write in your notebook, Reed entered the cafe at 10 a.m. That's data about me, about Reed. But I can't go over to you and say, hey, that's my data, and rip the page out of your notebook. And that's because that data, that bit of information that's written down on that paper, it's not owned by me. It is data about me, but it's simply not my data, not in the sense of any kind of legal ownership. And if there's a sense of moral ownership that you'd like to talk about, I'd like to know what that means. Now, perhaps you think that you should own that data, or that you should have control of that data, or that you should be able to withdraw consent from collecting that data in the first place. And maybe you're right about that, but you need an argument for that conclusion. You can't just say, it's about me, therefore it's mine. That's just a complete non sequitur. Okay, so now we put to the side, I hope anyway, just because the data is about you, it's therefore your data in any kind of legal ownership sense. You ought to have control, etc. Again, maybe you ought to have control, but you got to give me reasons. Okay. Here's confusion number two. I want to focus on this distinction between enabling versus doing something that's wrong. Enabling something that's wrong versus doing something wrong. So here's another line of thought that's frequently repeated. Here's a quote by this imagined other that there are many of. Quote, these companies collect our data, although I just said it's not really your data. They collect our data, and they run that data through their algorithms, and they make inferences about us, and then they bombard us with ads or tweak their social media feeds in a way that causes depression and anxiety amongst teenage girls or spreads election-undermining disinformation, and this is why we need data privacy protections. End quote of the imagined person. But the core problem with this line of reasoning is that it confuses what's really the bad stuff with something that enables the bad stuff. More specifically, it's the causing depression and anxiety and undermining elections that's bad. And it's true that those things could not have been done without collecting all that data, but it doesn't follow that collecting that data was wrong in the first place. Here's an example to bring out that point. I want you to suppose that there's this guy that you work with named Achilles, and you've noticed something about him. Whenever the fire alarm goes off, he grabs his heel as though to protect it. This is a piece of data that you have about him. And that's odd, you think. And you infer from your observation, I bet his heel is particularly weak. Now fast forward and you find yourself in a fight with Achilles. And given your observation and your inference, you attack his heel and you deal him the mortal blow. You actually kill the guy. Now that's pretty bad stuff. I'm going to assume it's an unjustified killing, your life wasn't in danger, etc. So your killing him was wrong. But was it ethically wrong to observe that he protects his heel when the fire alarm goes off? Was it ethically wrong to infer that his heel is weak? Were either of these things violations of his privacy? I don't think so. What's happened here is that you have some information about him, some directly observed, some inferred from observed data, and this enabled you to do something wrong. But being enabled isn't itself ethically problematic. After all, having a large knife in your kitchen enables you to stab people, but owning that knife is just fine. So returning now to company collection of data, it's certainly wrong to cause depression and anxiety amongst teenage girls and to undermine democratic elections. That stuff needs to be guarded against forcefully. But the fact that collecting the data and drawing inferences from that data enabled wrongdoing doesn't entail that collecting the data itself was ethically wrong. Okay, that was confusion number 2. So remember, confusion number 1, the fact that it's data about you doesn't mean that it's your data. And confusion number 2, the fact that collecting the data enables wrongdoing doesn't mean that collecting the data was itself an act of wrongdoing. Last thing, last confusion. This is about the use of the term surveillance. I think it's overused. And if there's anything that we hear a lot when we hear about data collection, it's that they're surveilling us. The author and academic Shoshana Zuboff brilliantly coined the phrase and named her book, Surveillance Capitalism. And the line between collection of data on the one hand and data surveillance on the other, in most any conversation on this topic, is frankly non-existent. But this is sloppy thinking, I think. Surveillance is very personal. Think about it. They're listening to us. They're looking at us. Beware. That's how I think about surveillance. But most data collection just isn't like this. And I think that we need to think clearer about surveillance and data collection and privacy. To help us see the point, I'm going to give you what I call 5 levels of data collection and use. And for each one, I want us to engage in this activity of rating the level of the violation from 0 to 10. 0 being no violation at all, and 10 being something like a stalker tapping a phone and using a telescopic lens to take videos from afar when you're in your house, something like that. So let's talk about these 5 levels and give them a rating of 0 to 10. Interested to hear what you think. Ready? Here's level 1. Data is collected about you automatically as you interact on an online platform. It's stored in servers that no one accesses, no one looks at that data, and it's never used for anything. I gotta say, this does not look like a case of a privacy violation to me. I'm inclined very much to give this a 0 out of 10. No one is looking at that data. It was automatically collected, never used for anything. I think there's no privacy violation here. Level 2. Data is automatically collected. It's stored on servers, anonymized, aggregated with the data of hundreds of thousands of others' data, and then used in some way or other that has nothing to do with you. No person actually looks at any of that data. I have to say, again, this doesn't seem like a violation of privacy to me. And if you have to insist, look, this is a case of privacy violation, I'm going to have to say it's a 1 out of 10. If it is a violation of privacy, I'd think it's more irksome than outrageous, like when my kids burst into the bathroom when I'm getting out of the shower. So that's level 2. Let's bump it up a little bit. Let's go to level 3. Data's automatically, reminder here, we're trying to find where's the surveillance. I don't think we have it yet. I don't even think we have privacy violations yet. And if we do, it's of a very low level. Let's try level 3. Data's automatically collected, stored on servers, aggregated with the data of thousands of others, It's not anonymized, and someone who doesn't know you glances at the spreadsheets of data. Maybe technically they quote unquote saw your name. It was in their visual field in the way that leaf number 373 was in your visual field when you looked at that tree with 5,433 leaves. But they didn't read your name, right? The name just passed before your visual field. And even if they did read your name, they'd have no idea who you are. I have to say, I'm still inclined to go with no violation of privacy here. And if it is, it's like a 1 out of 10. If someone insisted on a 2 out of 10, I guess I don't think that's crazy, but I think it's an oversensitivity. And look, that's fine. Look, reasonable people can have reasonable disagreements. I might think it's a 1 or 2 out of 10 if they do read your name but have no idea who you are and they forget 10 seconds after they read it. But honestly, that's really just me trying to make a compromise. I don't really think there's a violation of privacy here. And even if there is, it's of a very small magnitude. Okay, now let's get to level 4. We got 5 levels total. Here's level 4. Data is automatically collected, stored on servers, aggregated with the data of thousands of others. It's not anonymized. And now here's the key. Someone who, coincidentally, does know you, glances at the spreadsheet of data, and notices your name. Okay, I think this actually does constitute a violation of privacy. But how bad is that violation of privacy? And I think that it at least depends in part on what kind of information they learn. There's a difference in the degree of the violation depending upon whether it reveals that you bought a certain brand of towel versus its data about your medical history. So given the vast range of things that could be known, some trivial, some quite serious, this violation occurs somewhere in the range of anything from, say, 3 to 8 out of 10. And now let's go to level 5. Data about you is intentionally sought out. Remember, in level 4, they just come across it and they happen to know you. Level 5, data about you is intentionally sought out or collected by an employee at a company. It's highly sensitive data about you. Let's say it's medical history data or who you voted for in the last presidential election, however they got that, whether you're an Ashley Madison or something like that. And look, this is clearly a violation of privacy, and it probably falls somewhere in the order of a 9 or 10 out of our 10-point scale. Now, look, you don't have to agree with me on the exact numbers here, obviously. And surely there are more levels that we could add, like levels 1.5 and level 2.5, whatever. But the point is that lumping all data collection by companies as quote-unquote surveillance is just sloppy. Level 5 is certainly surveillance, where someone is intentionally getting information about you. Level 4 doesn't strike me as surveillance, but it is problematic from a privacy perspective. Levels 1 to 3 strike me as neither cases of surveillance nor ones in which privacy is violated. And if privacy was violated in those levels, then it's nothing to get crazy about. I think we can put our pitchforks down. Okay, so those are the 3 arguments against, I don't want to say against data privacy, but 3 ways that I think people are very confused when they think about data privacy. Again, number 1, you can't infer from the fact that some data is about you that it's yours. Number 2, there's a difference between enabling wrongdoing and actual wrongdoing. And in many cases, the collection of data enables wrongdoing, but is not itself something that's wrong to do. And number 3, it's not the case that all data collection is surveillance. It depends upon who, if anyone, is seeing that data, whether they know you, what the data is about, whether they intended to do it or not, and so on. Okay. Now, look, I hear obviously a big objection here. And I said at the start of this, I'm not against privacy. I think privacy is really important. And some people might worry, though, that what I'm really ultimately doing is that I'm, say, letting companies and government off the hook here. But look, as I said, there's a lot more to say about privacy. Suppose the direction of the arguments are right, and we really should be less worried about data collection and more worried about how that data is used. That's the main point here. It's less about the data being collected and more about how it's used, so say I. What would follow from that? The first thing to say is that we should still be fired up about surveillance. Okay? I'll say it again. We should still be fired up about surveillance, where we mean something specific by that. There are forms of data use that constitute genuine, morally atrocious forms of surveillance that we should outlaw. For instance, using all that collected data to create a facial recognition app that identifies people's names and addresses who happen to pass before you on a camera in a public setting should be illegal. We shouldn't permit spying with that level of ease. So I do think that genuine surveillance should be outlawed. I just don't think that all cases of data collection are surveillance. The second thing to say is that there are all sorts of ways that companies can treat people so poorly that we should probably make it illegal. Knowingly or recklessly causing depression and anxiety among teenage girls is a great candidate for illegality. Creating deepfake porn of people is another one. And when companies or individuals violate these laws, look, by all means, we should have Samuel Jackson rain down upon them with great fury and vengeance. So I'm all for holding companies accountable for their wrongdoing. Okay, one last point before closing. You might wonder, why be so concerned to let companies or government collect all this data in the first place? Maybe this is perhaps you conceding to me. Maybe it's not bad, but since it enables a lot of wrongdoing, shouldn't we just cut off the moral wrongness at its source? Shouldn't we put the power in the hands of the people who the data is about? Because that's a great strategy for decreasing using data for bad. I think that's a legitimate line of reasoning. It's to say that collecting that data is, if you like, instrumentally bad. It's not bad in itself. It's just bad because it makes other bad things happen. Fair enough. But I wouldn't be too quick about this. The primary reason that I think we need to get clear on this is that data collection also enables a tremendous amount of good, or at least it can. I don't think there's a single industry or government sector, healthcare, financial services, criminal justice, etc., that cannot benefit from better analyses of more data. We can get better at predicting disease, mental health crises, economic catastrophe, designing cures, delivering personalized financial guidance, a more just criminal justice system, and more. Data is not the enemy, it's an ingredient. And if we mix it in the right way with other ingredients, we can benefit society a great deal. On the other hand, if we run from unjustified fear of it, the hill of progress gets unnecessarily steep. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So, first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasylenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.